Recording in progress.
Critical Design Lab presents the Remote Access Archive.
You've got mail.
Video by Katie V. Sullivan, voiceover by Amy Hamrai, audio description by Kelsey Acton. This is a brief history of remote access.
Disabled people are inventors. Public space and transportation are often inaccessible. We are isolated, cut off from other disabled people, or from the opportunities that we value. The world is inaccessible, so we find ways to get around, hack, reinvent, remake, and use technologies and systems invented by people who never imagined us. Before the COVID-19 pandemic, many disabled people practiced remote access, using that ingenuity to find new ways of connecting over long distance.
A black and white photo, a rectangular school building, the Point Grey School for the Deaf and Blind.
Some of the earliest uses of remote access were for schooling. In 1926, the radio station CNVR made educational broadcasts specifically intended for Point Grey School for the Deaf and Blind in Vancouver.
The cover for the fall-winter 1962 issue of the Toomey Gazette, Communications by the Totally Disabled, a 30-page special feature. The cover image is a black and white photograph of Roger Leipart, a quadriplegic using a hand splint, a leather cuff, and a pencil stub to operate a telephone.
Schooling through telephone or intercom was common for polio survivors. People with polio were the start of a long history of groups of disabled people connecting with each other by newsletter.
A brown mailbox.
For many decades, the mail was the way that disabled people practiced remote access. In 1962, the cassette tape was invented. In an oral history interview, Thomas Reed, a brown-skinned black man with a smooth-shaven bald head and full, neat beard, reflects on how blind people would mail cassettes to each other.
The fact that when folks had access to cassette recorders, they would make cassettes for one another because not everybody read Braille. And maybe it was a more intimate way of communicating.
Telecommunications device for the deaf, or TDD, was also invented in the 1960s. TDD would take typing on a keyboard, turn it into sound that could travel down a telephone line and then be converted back into text on the other end. Later, in the 1980s and 90s, it would become central to the advocacy of the San Francisco Deaf AIDS Information Center. Kate McKinney explains.
Part of the advocacy that the Deaf AIDS Information Center did was to argue that all AIDS services should have dedicated TDD lines, and that should be a basic provision of access for deaf people to be able to access health and information services.
A play by Holland DeLille from the Ragged Edge Online, featuring a list of characters including a Crip chorus.
In the 1980s, newsletters like The Ragged Edge and Mouth magazine shared disability art, thinking, organized protests, and created a disability community using the mail system.
A scrolling view of a timeline from the 1990s on the Autistic Archive.
When email and the internet were invented, disabled people adopted these new technologies of remote access. In the 1990s, autistic people found each other on listservs and blogs, realized that they had shared experiences, and began to build a culture. Over the decades, we have figured out how to work, learn, and connect at a distance. For some disabled people, remote access was fundamental to how they lived their lives.
India Harville, a disability justice consultant and artist.
I've used Zoom for almost everything before the pandemic and during. For quite some time with my disabilities, I was unable to leave my home, and Zoom was one of the only ways that I could engage in community, aside from people who were coming to my house.
This often came at a cost. Disabled people who needed remote access lost out on opportunities to learn, build careers, and connect with other communities they were a part of. Remote access was too difficult and not how we do things. Kutsia Naki, a lawyer, activist, and podcaster, describes navigating technology for work as a blind person.
Prior to the pandemic, I think most employers had this culture that was very sort of antithetical to remote access, and systems weren't really set up to work well at home. So, for example, if I wanted to work at home and I needed to be on the VPN, the problem is when you're on the VPN at one of my jobs, JAWS doesn't work.
Oh.
So it was effectively impossible to work at home and have full access.
News headlines from early 2020 about the emergence of COVID-19 fade in and out.
Then in 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic began, and many people began learning, working, and connecting at a distance. Suddenly, remote access was everywhere. It turned out that remote access was only difficult until non-disabled people needed it too.
Two people dressed up, grinning at each other on Zoom. A document titled Cripping Pandemic Learning in Higher Education. People talking to each other on Zoom. An Instagram post advertising STEM dance party. All from the Remote Access Archive fade in and out.
During the pandemic, disabled people have used remote access to connect, celebrate, learn, work, and to advocate for better access and survival. Hector Ramirez also speaks about the power of remote access to ensure that disabled people are not forgotten. They reflect on the first year of the COVID-19 pandemic.
I think that's one of the things that we have been able to really hold our leaders accountable, because these meetings are recorded. So is that we have testimony, pleas, recommendations from people that use this as an advocacy tool until the day they died. We have this pandemic documented in ways that we weren't really aware was going to happen.
But video meetings and remote access didn't work for everyone. The Pew Research Center has found that disabled people are far more likely than non-disabled people to lack access to computers and phones, the hardware necessary to access the internet. And some people experience vertigo and Zoom fatigue. But even in the early days of the pandemic, when remote access lowered the risks of people becoming ill from COVID, there was attitudinal resistance. Julie Dind, who completed high school through mail, says,
I think it is funny that during the early days of the pandemic, people were really talking about the fact that online education won't work, that remote education had no value, and people would probably not learn anything. It's like, I'm in this classroom. That was my education for a very long time. And it's great to know that you don't value the way I have learned.
Headlines about returning to work, including headlines about disabled employees fighting for remote access through the court system.
But in this current climate of COVID denial, the option for remote work is increasingly denied to disabled people.
An ADA accommodation determination notice from an employer to an employee. The notice is dated 6/23/2022 and begins, this memo is in response to your request for an ADA accommodation to perform the essential functions of your position on a remote basis. At this time, you are not approved for an ADA accommodation to work remotely.
Despite the resistance of the non-disabled world, the denial of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, disabled people continue to use remote access.
Graphic of a voting box with a marked ballot divided into 4 quadrants, with pictures of a wheelchair, 2 hands signing, a person using a cane, a brain. Beneath in rainbow colors, #CrypTheVote.
Alice Wong, Greg Beltram, and Andrew Pulrang started #CrypTheVote, a bipartisan effort to engage voters and politicians in discussions around disability issues. It began on Twitter and then expanded to a podcast. Disabled people still use social media to advocate for change.
A group of pink spoons. Above them reads the text, Spoonies say hey. We travel through moonlight, pink-purple scenes of flowers and unidentified objects. This is Glitch Realm. Video art by Yo-Yo Lin and Kevin Gotkin, shown at a remote access party.
Disabled people still connect, create, and find joy at a distance. Remote access is and has been disability culture.
You can find more about the Remote Access Archive on the Critical Design Lab website, www.criticaldesignlab.com. The Remote Access Archive was created with generous support from the Social Science Research Council, the National Science Foundation, and Vanderbilt University.
Music courtesy of Blue Dot Sessions.